They called me predictable. A CFO too focused on spreadsheets to see betrayal coming. They used my name, my signature, my trust, to build a fortune behind my back. But what they forgot is that I was the one who built this empire in the first place. And I know exactly how to burn it down and rebuild it without them. The sound of polished shoes echoed against the marble floor of Nova Capital Group's executive wing. Graham Voss, chief financial officer and longtime pillar of the firm, moved with calm authority past glass offices and nodding assistants. At 53, his presence alone commanded the room. He stood tall, broad-shouldered, with silvering hair and storm-gray eyes that gave little away. Not to his peers, not to competitors, not even to his family. From the top floor of Nova's Westbridge headquarters, the city stretched endlessly beneath him. It was a view Graham had earned through over 2 decades of unbroken service. Mergers, acquisitions, performance models, and a spotless financial record. The kind of view that said, power lives here. He passed Talia Noor's desk without slowing. She, his trusted assistant, handed over a thick folder. Inside, projections for the Equinox Holdings acquisition, a $4.8 billion deal that could redefine Nova's market presence. Mr. Dane wants to meet at 11, Talia noted with her usual efficiency. Graham gave a nod and adjusted the time of another meeting. He preferred to review financials without interruption. Victor Dane, Nova's CEO, could wait. As Graham settled into the soft leather of his office chair, his phone buzzed. A message from his wife, Celeste Ward. Charity board dinner tonight. I'll be with Victor. Don't wait up. His thumb hovered over the screen for a second before locking it again. These charity events had become more frequent in the past year, though he dismissed the change as harmless networking. Celeste had always been active in high society philanthropy, nothing unusual there. A knock on the door drew his attention. Clara, his eldest daughter, entered without hesitation. At 24, fresh out of Eastford Business School, she had the poise of someone raised in polished halls and private clubs. Her appearance mirrored her mother's, golden hair, sharp green eyes, and a composure Graham knew wasn't natural, but taught. Victor mentioned a role opening in strategy, she said, positioning herself casually against his desk. Figured I'd remind you that my network could bring value. Graham studied her for a moment, noting not the ambition that had always been there, but the tone behind her words. It carried an entitlement that unsettled him. When he suggested the role was entry-level, her smile turned brittle. We both know I'm not entry-level. Victor agrees, she replied, before breezing out of the office. Later that day, messages came in from the twins, Colin and Jasper, second-year students at Braxton College. They wanted to catch up about internships, citing Victor Dane again. Graham's jaw tensed. At 19, the boys had always been eager, but this familiarity with his CEO felt rehearsed. By late afternoon, a video call came from Montvale Academy. Ivy, his 17-year-old daughter, called to say she'd heard from Victor too, about the family's foundation and school donations. Mom said you'd handle it, she added. Graham asked about her younger brother, Emmer. Lacrosse practice, she replied before reminding him of next Thursday's dinner. After the call, Graham sat in silence. Individually, the conversations were minor. Together, they painted a troubling pattern. The name Victor Dane echoed too often from too many mouths. Mouths that should have looked to him first, not his CEO. The remainder of his day blurred. Equinox Holdings absorbed most of his focus. As the office emptied, and the floor quieted, Talia stopped by one last time. Mr. Dane and Mrs. Ward left together earlier. Something about the charity event. Graham nodded absently. She lingered a second before leaving. He remained at his desk for another hour, poring over valuations and cash flow reports, work that usually soothed him. But that night it didn't. At 9:40 p.m., he drove back to Ravensshire Estate, a gated property nestled beyond the city. The long driveway, security cameras, and curated hedges were all symbols of the life he had built. A life of meticulous planning and relentless focus. But as he approached the house, something felt off. Through the French doors of the family room, he saw soft light, shadows moving, laughter, voices. He paused, not because of suspicion, but because of instinct. Something in the cadence of the voices struck him as wrong. He stood still, listening. Celeste's voice rang clearly, her tone laced with amusement and something colder beneath. The words struck with surgical precision. Once Equinox closes, everything transfers seamlessly. Graham signs where he's told. He's always trusted the spreadsheets. It was a moment, one heartbeat. Graham didn't move, didn't breathe. Inside, his wife, his children, and Victor Dane, his CEO, his supposed friend, discussed his role as if he were already gone. A useful shell, a trusted name on paper, a man they'd outmaneuvered without his knowledge. Clara laughed, recounting how Victor had shown her the real books. The twins boasted about internships. Ivy spoke of the future. Victor's voice joined in, detailing how the merger would bury everything beneath complexity, with Graham's signature on every line. Still, Graham didn't move. He didn't rush in. He didn't confront them. He absorbed. He calculated, just like he always had. And when he finally turned away, he walked in silence to his home office. The door closed behind him with a soft click. They believed him blind, predictable, contained. They had no idea who they were about to face. The door to Graham's home office closed with a soft, controlled finality. Outside its frame, the world moved on, laughter echoing down the marble hallways of Ravensshire Estate, footsteps on the stairs, a clink of glass in the kitchen. Inside, silence settled thick like smoke. He stood in the dim light for a long moment, then moved toward the secure terminal nestled at the corner of the room. The same terminal he had used for years to oversee mergers, track assets, calculate risk. Tonight, it would serve a different purpose. Logging into the system, Graham's fingers moved methodically across the keys, retrieving a decade's worth of financial records. Performance bonuses, merger payouts, fund transfers, all arranged with surgical precision, all with his name on them. But this time, he wasn't looking to project earnings. He was looking for patterns, and they emerged swiftly and chillingly clear. Each major acquisition he'd executed for Nova Capital had been followed by sizable bonus deposits into his personal accounts. At first glance, they had always appeared legitimate, performance-based compensation for a CFO with an impeccable track record. But now, viewed through the lens of betrayal, they told a different story. Those bonuses had become launch pads, funneled quietly into shell companies with unfamiliar names. Some based in jurisdictions with no extradition treaties. Some layered under layers of holding firms. Names he hadn't recognized before now rang with horrifying clarity. Trusts managed by entities tied to Celeste. Real estate assets co-owned by Clara's private foundation. Charities Ivy had mentioned but never explained. He pulled transaction logs, transfer statements, archived emails. The system had been built to audit others. Now it laid bare every blind spot in his own life. Every time he closed a successful deal, they'd siphoned from his bonuses, leveraging his integrity as a mask for financial relocation on a global scale. And the true brilliance of the scheme? It all looked legitimate. He had approved it, signed it, authorized it. Victor Dane hadn't needed to forge anything. He had used Graham's own reputation as the signature of trust. As the hours ticked past midnight, Graham's expression remained unreadable. Anger might come later. Right now, he was focused. He wasn't reacting, he was analyzing, mapping, strategizing. Documents on Clara's internship surfaced, positions she had never applied for, references that had come from Dane directly, Eastford connections groomed carefully. The evidence was there in black and white. She hadn't earned her path. She'd been escorted into it by Victor and Celeste as part of a long-game succession plan. The same applied to the twins. Invitations to Braxton, carefully timed donations, summer mentorships, arranged through front firms. Even Ivy's education had been a tool. Her tuition, masked as a grant, tied directly to a charity co-managed by Celeste. The same charity now flagged for audits in 3 states. And all of it sat on top of the Equinox Holdings deal, their grand finale. The structure of the acquisition had been designed with complexity in mind. Layers of LLCs, foreign holding companies, restructuring clauses that would bury illicit transfers under the weight of regulatory filings. Graham recognized the tactic. He'd used similar structuring in perfectly legal deals for years. But now he saw how his methods had been inverted. Turned against him, Victor planned to vanish. Celeste to disappear into exile with carefully moved capital. Their children, especially Clara, were set to inherit the company under a narrative of transition and legacy. And Graham? He was the fall. His signature sat on everything. If it collapsed, the blame would rest solely on him. A CFO who, it would be claimed, had orchestrated it all in secret. Graham didn't panic. He simply created a new folder, encrypted it, and began saving every file he unearthed. Every false grant, every suspicious transfer, every shell company. His calm was absolute. His movements measured. Not a single click wasted. At 4:17 a.m., he reached out to Declan Hart, his personal attorney. One Victor and Celeste didn't know existed. The message was brief. Initiate Protocol 7. Full scope. Ironclad. Then he turned to the merger documents. The Equinox deal was still in its critical phase. No signatures had been finalized, which meant he still had time. Hours passed. When sunlight crept into the corners of the office, Graham was still working. The silence in the house felt different now. Not empty, but charged. He could hear soft footsteps in the hallway, someone murmuring in the kitchen. Normalcy trying to return. Let them enjoy the illusion. They believed they had planned the perfect betrayal. But they had miscalculated. They had built it all on the back of a man who had survived a lifetime in high-stakes finance. A man who had buried giants and revived empires. They thought they had chosen the perfect accomplice. They had unknowingly created their greatest threat. The morning light over Ravensshire estate revealed nothing of the night's unraveling. In the world beyond Graham Voss's home office, everything seemed undisturbed. Birdsong threaded through the trees. A distant gardener trimmed the hedges, and the smell of brewed coffee wafted from the kitchen. But inside the glass-walled room where Graham had once drafted growth models and steered billion-dollar strategies, a different kind of operation had begun. By 7 a.m., his desk displayed an intricate network of data points, cross-reference transfers, company valuations, bonus ledgers, and encrypted communications. Years of transactions had been repurposed into evidence. His financial acumen, once used to grow Nova Capital Group, now turned inward like a scalpel. His mind, sharpened by decades of corporate precision, operated in near silence. The merger, the Equinox Holdings deal, was massive, designed to overwhelm due diligence teams, to distract regulators, to require so many approvals that no single person could see its full structure. Victor Dane had crafted it that way on purpose. But Graham could see it all. He'd built the frameworks Nova used for deals like this. He knew where shortcuts might be taken, where small missteps created legal leverage. Now, he exploited that knowledge against the very system he had helped construct. He began by isolating the merger's most obscure components: third-tier shell acquisitions, equity redistribution pathways, and back-channel valuation hikes. Each one had been positioned to camouflage illegal asset shifts, and each one was now a thread he pulled loose. Declan Hart, his personal attorney, responded with immediate precision. Legal protocols were activated. Backup servers engaged. Key evidence was duplicated and routed through firewalled networks. Dozens of NDAs were prepared, not for silence, but for protection. By mid-morning, Graham had uncovered inconsistencies Victor hadn't bothered to disguise. Patterns emerged: bonuses that mirrored transaction flows, fake valuation reports disguised as market summaries, falsified timestamps on digital approvals. Celeste's involvement was no longer speculation. Her fingerprints were on everything, from fraudulent charity disbursements to off-grid trusts. She had co-piloted the scheme with eerie consistency. He began deploying containment measures. Under the guise of routine system maintenance, Graham used his full-access credentials as CFO to segment Nova's financial platforms. Temporary freezes on internal transfers were issued. Red flags were placed on accounts tied to suspicious activity. Offshore movement was throttled without alert. From the outside, it would appear as system slowness, nothing unusual during a deal of this scale. But inside the system, Graham had taken control. Next, he reached out to Elias Kwan, a trusted contact in Zurich. Quiet, discreet, and wholly loyal. Instructions were clear. Begin monitoring every account bearing signatures from Celeste or Victor. Prepare to move any recoverable assets into a secure holding structure. It had to look like part of the merger strategy. Nothing could appear retaliatory. Yet, a soft knock interrupted his concentration. Clara's voice filtered through the door, casual and unsuspecting. She mentioned something about Victor, about networking, about an alumni dinner with Eastford executives. Her tone was light, but Graham detected the undercurrent. Her confidence wasn't natural, it was fed by someone who had promised her power. He responded without emotion, offering a vague comment about reviewing final numbers. She left, unaware that her future role had just been effectively deleted. As the door closed behind her, he placed a call to Everett Kane, a longtime acquaintance turned high-ranking official at the Federal Compliance Bureau. Their relationship had been built slowly, over years of mutual respect. Graham offered a summary, brief but potent. Everett didn't hesitate. A secure channel was established. Investigative protocols initiated. What began as whispers would soon become a storm. By afternoon, Graham had activated Protocol 7 in full. Dozens of email drafts sat encrypted and timestamped, addressed to Nova's board. Each one included a unique set of documents, tailored proof of misconduct, charts, source reports, legal breakdowns. Enough to trigger emergency meetings. Enough to sever trust in Victor Dane with a single click. The final piece was internal, Nova's own system. Graham wrote a sequence, a simple script innocuous in appearance. But it would trigger system-wide alerts if any of the flag parties attempted to move funds after 6 p.m. that day. The trap was digital, elegant, and irreversible. When the sun dipped low behind the estate trees, Graham paused for the first time. His hands ached. His eyes were dry. But everything was in place. The man they believed to be a pawn had repositioned every piece on the board. His family moved about the house, voices laughing in the hall, dinner plans being made, shallow conversations drifting up the stairs. They had no idea that every plan they had laid was now riddled with invisible fractures. That the foundation beneath them had already begun to crumble. They would learn soon enough. The next morning began like any other inside the polished walls of Nova Capital Group. Elevator doors opened with smooth finality, heels clicked across marble, and assistants tapped quietly on keyboards while executives read headlines over black coffee. But beneath the familiar rhythm, the company's foundation had already begun to shift. Graham Voss arrived earlier than usual, blending into the morning stillness with calculated ease. No one knew that in the past 48 hours, he had mapped out every detail of a betrayal that had taken nearly a decade to execute, and only one night to unravel. At 8 a.m., the emergency board meeting commenced in the glass conference chamber that overlooked Westbridge City's skyline. It had been called under the pretense of last-minute changes to the Equinox Holdings deal, a technicality that raised no suspicion. Each seat at the boardroom table bore a simple USB drive, and as board members plugged in, brows furrowed. Across multiple screens, detailed documents began to appear. Transaction logs, audit trails, internal memos, timestamps, signatures. One by one, the directors went silent. Victor Dane entered 5 minutes late. His usual confident stride now tinged with irritation. He hadn't seen the trap yet. Not fully. But the pieces were starting to move faster than he could control. Celeste Ward never made it to the office. She was home, frantically dialing overseas numbers, watching account dashboards freeze before her eyes. Swiss-based trusts, charity-linked holdings, offshore entities, all locked. The names she had used to secure her exit had vanished from the interface, replaced with cold error messages. Graham had acted first. With assistance from Elias Kwan and legal measures from Declan Hart, he had secured every legitimate asset still attached to Nova and rerouted it to protective structures that no one could access but him. The illegal pipelines, those routed through Celeste's hands and Victor's schemes, had been exposed, documented, and frozen. By noon, the story had broken. Headlines scrolled across financial terminals and news networks. Allegations of fraud rock Nova Capital Group. Equinox merger suspended pending investigation. Stock alerts flooded inboxes. Questions mounted. Victor attempted damage control, making calls, summoning legal teams, trying to frame the emerging evidence as misunderstandings. But the documents Graham had distributed were airtight. There were no missing gaps, no holes to hide in. Every page bore Victor's name beside Graham's, the signature of trust, now weaponized against its forger. Federal agents were already en route. At Ravenshire Estate, Celeste's panic grew. She had counted on time, on distraction, on delay. But Graham had given her none. Her calls to attorneys went unanswered. Her bank contacts stopped responding. Her private security detail resigned without notice. And the children, once so carefully positioned, had already begun to feel the cracks. Clara received a call from Eastford's alumni board before noon. Her internship offer was suspended pending review. Colin and Jasper were pulled from a Braxton mentorship program. Ivy was notified by Montvale Academy's ethics committee. Inquiries were being launched into her scholarship arrangements and associated donations. Victor made one last desperate move, boarding a private aircraft chartered to an undisclosed location. He never made it. The pilot, James Wilson, was not his loyal employee as believed, but one of Graham's quiet allies, placed long ago for precisely this moment. The jet was rerouted midair, escorted to a secure airstrip where Federal Compliance Bureau agents awaited. The arrest was quiet, precise, and complete. Back at Nova's headquarters, board members turned to Graham not with suspicion, but with silent gratitude. He had saved the company. He had preserved its assets. He had acted not as a man betrayed, but as a leader protecting what mattered. Celeste's downfall followed swiftly. Recordings of her boasting about using Graham's spreadsheets to make the fraud look clean were released by legal authorities. Her charity empire collapsed. Her social circle vanished overnight. The same names that once praised her now pretended not to know her. By the end of the day, her accounts were under federal seizure orders. Her name became a trending topic, not for her elegance, but for her deception. Back at the estate, Graham stood alone in his office, watching live feeds from various sources. Clara crying into her phone. The twins arguing over who had known what. Ivy stunned into silence. Emmer, the youngest, staring at the floor in quiet disbelief. They had played their parts well. Too well. They had believed in Victor. Believed in the story they'd been sold. That their father was merely a stepping stone to power. But they hadn't realized that Graham had written the entire playbook they were trying to perform. That night, as silence settled over the estate, Graham sat with the weight of both victory and loss. He had destroyed their plan. But they had destroyed something else, something more personal. Weeks passed since the collapse. What had once seemed like an unshakable empire of wealth and influence now lay scattered in headlines, courtrooms, and sealed evidence folders. Nova Capital Group, under the careful stewardship of Graham Voss, had not only survived the crisis, it had emerged stronger. The board had acted swiftly. In the wake of Victor Dane's arrest and Celeste Ward's unraveling, Graham was appointed interim CEO by unanimous vote. His leadership during the chaos had not only shielded the company's assets but preserved its reputation. Investors regained confidence. Stock rebounded. Media outlets shifted their tone from scandal to strategy. Inside Nova's newly restructured headquarters, now bearing the understated monogram Nova Ethics on its executive floor, Graham worked in silence. There were no portraits of predecessors, no plaques commemorating past deals, only a single framed line on the wall behind his desk. Precision is not enough. Integrity must follow. Clara Voss now lived in a modest apartment under a different surname, far from Eastford and its collapsing web of influence. Her academic record had been retroactively examined and partially revoked. What remained was not a degree, but a series of unanswered questions. The twins, Colin and Jasper, had their admissions to Braxton College formally rescinded after revelations surrounding illegal donations and falsified recommendations. Their trust funds, once swollen with unearned wealth, had been frozen. Both attempted to rebuild, one through online investment schemes, the other through half-hearted consulting pitches. Neither succeeded. Ivy, still a teenager, had withdrawn from Montvale Academy. She changed her last name and applied to a community college under a new identity. Of all Graham's children, she seemed to understand the weight of what had happened, and sought distance, not denial. Emmer, the youngest, began studying engineering on a merit scholarship at a state university. He reached out occasionally, his messages formal but respectful. Graham never forced conversation. Some bridges, he knew, would need time, if they were ever rebuilt at all. Celeste was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison for her role in the charity embezzlement scheme. After release, she was placed under house arrest in a small coastal town, stripped of access to luxury, legacy, and leverage. Her public image was unsalvageable. The woman once praised for elegance and influence had become a parable of deception. Victor Dane remained in a federal facility under maximum security. His appeals failed one after another, each one dismantled by the same level of thorough documentation he had once used to manipulate others. Graham never spoke to him again. Instead, he built something else. The Voss Foundation for Corporate Ethics launched 6 months after the scandal broke. Its mission simple but revolutionary: to expose and prevent family-based financial conspiracies within corporate systems. It partnered with global regulators, created case study frameworks, and developed predictive software that flagged unethical nepotism before it metastasized. Its flagship curriculum, The Bonus Mask, How Legacy Can Corrupt Leadership, became mandatory reading in business schools across the country. Graham never used his family's names in public. He never gave interviews about them. The facts were public record. The silence was deliberate. His focus remained on reform, on changing the landscape that had once allowed people like Victor and Celeste to operate unchecked. Under his leadership, Nova adopted full transparency protocols, enforced quarterly ethics audits, and required independent review boards for any executive appointment. In 5 years, Nova's value tripled. At the annual Global Leadership Summit in Westbridge, Graham was awarded the Ethical Transformation Medal, the highest honor given to a corporate executive for rebuilding institutional integrity. He accepted it with calm gratitude. No grand speeches, just a single sentence: leadership begins where legacy ends. Back at the Ravensshire estate, now converted into a private research retreat for ethical finance, Graham stood alone in his former office, the same room where it had all begun. He looked out over the manicured grounds and thought not of victory, but of clarity. They had underestimated him. They had used his loyalty as a lever, his reputation as a shield. But in the end, they had taught him a lesson he would never forget, and he had taught them one they would never escape. As evening fell, he turned off the lights and closed the door for the last time. The chapter had ended. The legacy had changed. Not just his, but the system's.